Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the first chapter of Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. In this work, Foucault is going to synthesize a lot of the themes that he's going to play on throughout his work, which is concerning the relationship between power and knowledge, as well as how a social field is constructed. Foucault is essentially going to be looking at the way in which punishment and discipline changed their forms throughout history, and how we like to think that we are more humane today. But Foucault, maybe a little bit provocatively, is going to argue that in fact that is not the case, and we have tended towards a situation of much more extreme control than we may be aware of. The chapter starts out dealing the case of Damien in 1757, and this was a regicide, so he killed a monarch, and he is being tortured. And this is a famously gruesome method, which I won't go into terrible detail with. It included the amende honorable, where he basically was conveyed into the Church of Paris wearing nothing but a shirt, holding a torch of burning wax weighing 2 pounds. This would burn holes in his skin, and this would be filled with molten metals. His limbs would be pulled off by horses. Pincers would be used, all sorts of terrible torture techniques, and it is extremely drawn out. It's about 4 pages of just detailed torture and, the relationship of the clergy to all this. And in stark contrast to that, 80 years later, so that would be 1837, we have Léon Fouché's drawing up of the rules of the House of Young Prisoners in Paris. And it's this very detailed prison regiment that lays out in exact time increments what each prisoner is going to do. Will begin at 6 in the morning in winter, 5 in the summer. They will work for 9 hours a day throughout the year. 2 hours a day will be devoted to instruction. Work in the day will end at 9 o'clock in winter and at 8 in the summer. And then it gives you a list of rising, work, meal, school, and it's giving you, they're timed to drum rolls to do certain things at different times. So we have a public execution and we have a timetable. And he says that he wants to focus on the disappearance of torture as a public spectacle. And we tend to ignore torture because, of course, it's not very prominent in our societies today. But in fact, he wants to show that there are different strategies being used to control the ways that we act, and there are a number of different reasons why different methods go in and out. For example, he mentions that oftentimes the savagery of torture was thought to outweigh the crime itself, and he quotes this person, Beccaria: "The murder that is depicted as a horrible crime is repeated in cold blood remorselessly." So now it appears almost as a worse violence than the crime itself. And thus, a shift in strategy happened in which punishment then became essentially hidden. And that is something that he wants to reveal, is that punishment is often done in the shadows and done in a way that is not explicitly mentioned within the discourse, even though it tends to function as such. He says its effectiveness is seen as resulting from its inevitability, not from its visible intensity. It is the certainty of being punished and not the horrifying spectacle of public punishment that must discourage crime. So thus, punishment takes on not only a deterring factor, but Foucault's actually going to go even deeper and say that discipline is going to fundamentally, juridically impose ways of being upon every single person. And he mentions that the publicity of the torture is replaced by the publicity of the trial, of the conviction itself, marking the offender with a negative sign of guilt. And as such, we keep our distance. We, the people punishing, keep their distance in order to have a seal of secrecy. And he calls this a double system of protection that justice has set up between itself and the punishment it imposes. So an important thing to mention here is that punishment and the apparatus by which that punishment is given are seen as two different things, when Foucault wants to point out that actually, even the notion of abnormality or punishable crimes itself, Foucault wants to see as something which is initiated by power relations. And thus, he wants to focus on this sort of theoretical disavowal that occurs in the juridical sense. He says, do not imagine that the sentences that we judges pass are activated by a desire to punish. They are intended to correct, reclaim, cure. A technique of improvement represses in the penalty the strict expiation of evildoing and relieves the magistrates of the demeaning task of punishing. In modern justice, and on the part of those who dispense it, there is a shame of punishing, which does not always preclude zeal. So there's an attempt to distance the act of imposing punishment from the idea of what is punishable itself. Torture became a sort of demeaning force because people kind of were like, well, this is crazy, and you're just enacting your own form of crime. So rather than just, of course, stop disciplining, if that was the case, the state would probably collapse. It had to change its means. And thus, Foucault is essentially pointing out here a punishment-body relation. And he points out that the body now serves as an instrument or intermediary. If one intervenes upon it to imprison it, or to make it work, it is in order to deprive the individual of a liberty that is regarded both as a right and as a property. The body, according to this penalty, is caught up in a system of constraints and privations, obligations and prohibitions. Physical pain, the pain of the body itself, is no longer the constituent element of the penalty. And he calls this an economy of suspended rights. So punishment becomes irrevocably tied to the normal person who has these rights, but also constraints put upon them, and that punishment essentially works by deprivation, by turning one into a have-not via a apparatus. And thus he mentions the ways in which people like doctors and psychiatrists were added into things like capital punishment. And he says when the moment of execution approaches, the patients are injected with tranquilizers, a utopia of judicial reticence. Take away life, but prevent the patient from feeling it. Deprive the prisoner of all rights, but do not inflict pain. Impose penalties, free of all pain. Recourse to pseudo-pharmacology and to various physiological disconnectors, even if it is temporary, is a logical consequence of this non-corporeal penalty. So there's a very interesting contrast here, which is that these forms of modern capital punishment were seen as more humane, but really they embody a sort of contradiction which is inherent to the performativity of the state. That we want to take away life, but it has to happen so quick and so instantaneously. And thus, he mentions that this is an execution that affects life rather than the body. This is an attempt to have something to control about life itself. And this rings very similar to, for example, Jean Baudrillard, who talks about these right-to-life movements or the initiation of homes for the elderly in order to give a peaceful end of their life. And Baudrillard quite provocatively says that this is equally an attempt not merely to give one a good life, but a timely death, an organized death, to organize society around the going under of each individual human. And thus, he mentions that, for example, in England in 1760, hanging was becoming more popular, and there was a hanging machine, which we see, it's in like Pirates of the Caribbean and a bunch of other media, where the floor kind of goes out from under them, and it helps to make things go by quicker. It helps to do three things, one of which is to make an equal death for all. So regardless of the crime, at a certain point, it becomes just a axiological question of, well, this is the death that you deserve, and everyone's going to get it, and the state is going to decide it. Number two is one death per condemned man, obtained by a single blow without recourse to those long and consequently cruel methods of execution. So this death is almost sped up to the maximum. It becomes a question of an instantaneous incorporeal transformation, as Deleuze and Guattari call it. And this is an important thing, is that the really maximum efficiency of the state comes when each of these orders can be imposed immediately and quickly. And the idea of death doing that is quite scary. And thirdly, punishment for the condemned man alone, since decapitation, the capital punishment of the nobility, was the least shaming for the criminal's family. So there's an insistence upon, being humane about this, but we can equally see that this is a question of concealment, of essentially making a form of death in which it solely affects each one who is being killed as an individual subject, completely detached from all relations. So it's almost an effort by the state to lay out everyone on a flat plane and draw up all these relations between people and selectively choose which operations to use at a particular point. And thus he mentions an invariable mechanical means whose force and effect may also be determined. And I really think that point of mechanism, that's something, for example, that Deleuze and Guattari point out when they constantly use machine metaphors. And in fact, it's not a metaphor in a sense of, an input and an output that is oriented towards a certain function. But he says, in kind of following this idea of like the hanging machine and the speeding up of death, he talks about the guillotine and how this is going to lead to things being scarcely noticed almost. He says the guillotine takes life almost without touching the body, just as prison deprives of liberty or a fine reduces wealth. It is intended to apply the law not so much to a real body capable of feeling pain as to a juridical subject, the possessor, among other rights, of the right to exist. It had to have the abstraction of the law itself. So like I mentioned before, it's putting everything on a flat plane and turning one into a juridical subject, which is to say, you're no longer a family man, or you're no longer a member of an institution, which would incur relations to other people and potentially the possible, upsetting of someone if you die. Instead, it's turning one into a pure subject under the law, a juridical subject. That's what that term means. And by doing so, it essentially abstracts one in a very properly legal sense. And in addition to the addition of the guillotine, leading up to, the march to the scaffold, they would be forced to wear a black veil. And this black veil essentially ensured a loss of visibility of the killing occurred. Foucault says the condemned man was no longer to be seen. Only the reading of the sentence on the scaffold announced the crime, and that crime must be faceless. The more monstrous a criminal was, the more he must be deprived of light. He must not see or be seen. And this is a really interesting part in which, for example, it's typically seen that something like an open-air prison is more humane. But on Foucault's analysis, he would say that, in fact, often when things seem as if they're the most visible, that's when these most invisible forces are being incurred upon one, in which the deprivation of light occurs, in which it always is happening under the surface. And that's what he's trying to do here. And thus, he says, the last vestige of the great public execution was its annulment, a drapery to hide a body. And this leads Foucault to talk about a new ethic of legal death, which is quite strange because it's typically considered, for example, in the Hobbesian sense, that we are born chaotic in this state of nature, and we're constantly fighting for our own well-being, and as such, we will voluntarily enter into states only because it allows us to create contractual obligations between each other that I won't kill if you don't kill, and also that we can institute a power which is coercive enough and stands over us to prevent us from bypassing those bonds. And as such, the state is typically seen as that which ensures life. But in fact, Foucault wants to shift the phraseology a little bit and implicate that the state has more to do with the instrumentalization of life, the selection of life, and the calculation of legal death. And thus, when detailing the march to the scaffold and the guillotine, he says witnesses who described the scene could even be prosecuted, thereby ensuring that the execution should cease to be a spectacle and remain a strange secret between the law and those it condemns. One has only to point out so many precautions to realize that capital punishment remains fundamentally, even today, a spectacle that must actually be forbidden. So again, focusing on that loss of visibility, there's an attempt to separate the people in the society from the punishments that are supposedly being done on behalf of the society via the judge. And this is an essential point that Nietzsche makes on the New Idol in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Is he mentions that one of the greatest lies the state tells is that I, the state, am the people. Foucault's pointing out here very clearly that in fact the state wants to make us think that we, the people, willingly incur this upon ourselves, and that in fact this isn't a creative strategy. And as a result of a shifting away from that drawn-out corporeal sort of punishment, he mentions the fact that in the pursuit of this humanism, there was a focus shifted towards the soul. He says the expiation that once rained down upon the body must be replaced by a punishment that acts in depth on the heart, the thoughts, the will, the inclinations. Mabley formulated the principle once and for all. Punishment, if I may put it, should strike the soul rather than the body. And there's an emphasis on a very particular kind of control, which only occurs in the modern situation, in which not only is it merely a question of the act itself, but we start bringing in things like the inclination of the criminal, or the will or thoughts. This is almost like some thought crime kind of like 1984 stuff going on here, where it's a more fine-grained attempt to control, which is often masked as being more humane to the criminal. And he essentially likens this to a comedy, and goes on to say that this is essentially a substitution of objects, that he says certainly the crimes and offenses on which judgment is passed are juridical objects defined by the code, but judgment is also passed on the passions, instincts, anomalies, infirmities, maladjustments, effects of environment or heredity. Acts of aggression are punished. So also through them is aggressivity. Rape, but at the same time perversions. Murders, but also drives and desires. That last part about drives and desires is especially important because we can see that we're going towards a more molecular sort of attack on particular things as illegal. Now, the idea of crime is not only a substitution of objects, but an addition of new juridical objects, infirmities, anomalies. So now we're bringing in questions of what is normal, and the state starts to become integral in basically deciding what drives are normal. And we can see this, for example, in government-instituted hormone therapy, which it was called therapy, but really it was just chemical castration, to homosexuals. And this was done, right throughout the 20th century. This happened to Alan Turing, the inventor of the Turing test. And Foucault highlights that behind the pretext of explaining an action are ways of defining an individual. So there's an attempt to do something which might not seem very torturous, which is to concretize, to identify, to subjugate through the act of knowledge itself. And we often don't think that knowledge could be something which acts in such a way. But he says they are punished by means of a punishment that has the function of making the offender not only desirous, but also capable of living within the law and of providing for his own needs. They are punished by the internal economy of a penalty which, while intended to punish the crime, may be altered, shortened, or in certain cases extended, according to changes in the prisoner's behavior, and they are punished by the security measures that accompany the penalty: prohibition of entering certain areas, probation, obligatory medical treatment, and which are intended not to punish the offense, but to supervise the individual, to neutralize his dangerous state of mind, to alter his criminal tendencies, and to continue even when this change has been achieved. And this is something, if we can imagine the state as some anthropomorphized entity, and we're thinking of the state, or as the state, in a certain sense, torture only allows you so much control because you make death a lot more of a possibility that people are readily entertaining with prematurely. You're killing people off and you don't have a chance to supervise, to control. You don't have a chance to bring out potential effects by cloaking these strategies in something humane. And thus, not only is punishment a question of the enacting of the punishment itself, but also the potential for absorption of a subject back into the state, right? It's a question of rehabilitation. And this notion of rehabilitation is often considered something very humane, but I think something Foucault wants to point out is who is deciding what is humane and who is human, to literally just change the pronunciation of that word a little bit. And this is essentially concerned with, probation, obligatory actions to be taken immediately after the punishment that lead into someone's life, such that not only is there this binary between being in society and being in prison, but now you're on probation, which is kind of this middle ground, which is not merely just a effort of punishment, but going downstream from that punishment, it ensures supervision of someone. It assures a neutralization of tendencies which may be dangerous to the state. Maybe this happens all throughout history. We could just take the Alan Turing example again. When something like homosexuality threatens culture, this threatens the state because the state, as Deleuze and Guattari say, is essentially conserved or worried about conservation. It's concerned with conservation, with ensuring that things stay the way they are. And this doesn't merely just apply to the legal field, but to the social field that the legal field interacts with. And thus, it is integral, if the state wants to survive, to essentially, as he says, this is a question of expansionist tendencies, of expanding into the social field, such that the lines between the juridical and the social are blurred. And Foucault's particularly interesting because he was very much an activist type. He was in kind of the anti-psychiatry movement as well as the anti-prison movement. There was this very funny story of Foucault where he was asked to sign a petition asking for more humane treatment for these prisoners, essentially like a relaxation of certain obligations that were put on the prisoners. And Foucault, of course, signed this, and they felt really good. The organization that was trying to enact this change felt really good about this until they figured out that Foucault signed it because, in fact, he wants to disband the notion of prisons at all. So Foucault was not merely a reformer, but he was also a destroyer in the Nietzschean sense. And of course, that was not, that was a step too far for them. They probably for Foucault, he would say that they're still internalizing the state's notion of discipline and punish. But he mentions, for example, the role of psychiatrists. And there's also another funny story of Foucault where he was psychoanalyzed when he was younger, and I'm sure that was a very funny experience for the psychoanalyst because Foucault is incredibly intelligent. But he says psychiatric expertise, but also in a more general way, criminal anthropology and the repetitive discourse of criminology, find one of their precise functions here, by solemnly inscribing offenses in the field of objects susceptible of scientific knowledge. They provide the mechanisms of legal punishment with a justifiable hold not only on offenses, but on individuals, not only on what they do, but also on what they are, will be, may be. So the introduction of psychiatry here, I mean, we can think about, for example, race science and phrenology, in which science was, it was a state-sanctioned scientific enterprise to attempt to dig up biological differences between the races that would establish one as more inferior with the other. Or not merely establish that one was more inferior than the other, but confirm that which was already culturally present in order to continue to subdue. And thus, this idea of scientific knowledge, Foucault is pointing out here, is tied up with a notion of normalcy, which is defined by power, of what behaviors are considered normal or too radical. And thus, this scientific, quote-unquote, objectivity is actually a little bit more dangerous than that. And he elaborates that the question is no longer simply, has the act been established and is it punishable? But also, what is this act? What is this act of violence or this murder? To what level or to what field of reality does it belong? Is it a fantasy, a psychotic reaction, a delusional episode, a perverse action? It is no longer simply who committed it, but how can we assign the causal process that produced it? Where did it originate in the author himself? Instinct, unconscious, environment, heredity? It is no longer simply what law punishes this offense, but what would be the most appropriate measures to take? How do we see the future development of the offender? What would be the best way of rehabilitating him? A whole set of assessing, diagnostic, prognostic, normative judgments concerning the criminal have become lodged in the framework of penal judgment. And this is that notion of normalcy coming back again. That no longer is there this relatively distant relationship between the judge and that person which is condemned, but there is a quote-unquote humane concern with their future. But in fact, this is a future which now is an object of knowledge and an object of control for the state. It becomes a question of being diagnostic and prognostic. Just like at the very beginning of this chapter, when he mentions the drawing up of the rules of the House of Young Prisoners in Paris by Léon Fouché. And thus, this has turned, as he says, the assertion of guilt into a strange scientifico-juridical complex. Now, throughout this, Foucault looks specifically at the legal system and the social milieu of France, just in order to keep it kind of concise and manageable. And he mentions the presence of madness in the penal code, and he mentions this Article 64 in the 1810 penal code. And this article states, I'll just quote, that there is neither crime nor offense if the offender was of unsound mind at the time of the act. The possibility of ascertaining madness was therefore a quite separate matter from the definition of an act as a crime. The gravity of the act was not altered by the fact that its author was insane, nor the punishment reduced as a consequence. The crime itself disappeared. So this penal code is explicitly stating that if someone is mad, the crime is essentially absolved there in an unsound state of mind. But he mentions that very soon after, in the 19th century, the courts began to misunderstand Article 64. And there were several Supreme Court appeals which confirmed that insanity could lighten a criminal sentence, but people were still being tried and convicted and sentenced while it was clearly established that they were mad. And he says, they accepted that one could be both guilty and mad. Less guilty the madder one was. Guilty, certainly, but someone to be put away and treated rather than punished. Not only a guilty man, but also dangerous, since quite obviously sick. So here, the notion of sickness, which essentially incurs normative judgments, right? Normative of prescribing a norm that ought to be followed, is essentially going to mean that guilt doesn't necessarily only incur going to a prison, but now it's bifurcated into the prison or the mental institution, like l'hôpital général that he talks about in Madness and Civilization. And thus we have this neutralization, this normalization of people through a variety of practices, which we might consider humane, but I think it's also very fair to accept the idea Foucault is putting forward that this is at least partially a method of control. And going back to psychiatry, he says that the practice of calling on psychiatric expertise, which is widespread in the assize courts and sometimes extended to courts of summary jurisdiction, means that the sentence, even if it is always formulated in terms of legal punishment, implies, more or less obscurely, judgments of normality, attributions of causality, assessments of possible changes, anticipations as to the offender's future. So we like to think that the state is famously neutral, but in fact, and this is something that, for example, Aristotle admits in his virtue ethics, that the idea of the perfect society, or the idea of how the polis ought to be run, is essentially tied up with value judgments of what do we value, what kinds of behaviors do we want to constitute as good habits and thus the state furnish. So this is something that we've come away from really thinking about, but the state is not objective in this sense. It is determined by normative judgments, which are a cultural product as well as an imposed process to an extent. And thus, Foucault wants to point out the travel from strict punishment to prescription. And we like to think that punishment is terrible, like torture and stuff like this is terrible, but being prescribed certain rules to follow, that's not as bad. But in fact, Foucault wants to show how this is intimately tied with what it means to exist in a society. Are these institutions? He notes, instead of insanity eliminating the crime according to the original meaning of Article 64, Every crime and even every offense now carries with it, as a legitimate suspicion, but also as a right that may be claimed, the hypothesis of insanity, in any case of anomaly. And the sentence that condemns or acquits is not simply a judgment of guilt, a legal decision that lays down punishment. It bears within it an assessment of normality and a technical prescription for a possible normalization. Today, the judge, magistrate, or juror certainly does more than judge. And this is one of the more pernicious things, is we often talk about things that have been lost in the past, that our society, we're just not in tune with how things used to be. And Foucault he's not saying that all the good things happen before the state, but he's saying that via the institution of discipline and punish, this is essentially tied to a process of defining what is a normal human. And by defining what a normal human is and ensuring that we have a practice to essentially distill all of the polis into a normal person, it essentially creates a homogenized community that is easier to govern, to control. He mentions that this creates, by instituting a wider method of punishment, not only judges, but kind of other forms of subsidiary judges, and having, society in a sense is also judging, that this creates a proliferation of the authorities of judicial decision-making and extends its powers of decision well beyond the sentence. So by worrying about things like rehabilitation or things like normalcy in the future, the likelihood that they may incur some punishment again or do some crime again, essentially encourages and ensures the state's continual infection into society in a way that goes well beyond just the sentence. Foucault states that what is odd about modern criminal justice is that although it has taken on so many extrajudicial elements, it has done so not in order to be able to define them juridically and gradually to integrate them into the actual power to punish. On the contrary, it has done so in order to make them function within the penal operation as non-juridical elements. In order to stop this operation being simply a legal punishment, in order to exculpate the judge from being purely and simply he who punishes. Of course, we pass sentence, but this sentence is not in direct relation to the crime. It is quite clear that for us it functions as a way of treating a criminal. We punish, but this is a way of saying that we wish to obtain a cure. Today, criminal justice functions and justifies itself only by this perpetual reference to something other than itself, by this unceasing reinscription in non-juridical systems. Its fate is to be redefined by knowledge. And thus, the notion of punishment and cure essentially leads to a prescriptive form of control via integration of non-juridical elements, which is to say you have, the state and all its various little inner workings, and then you've got the people outside of the state whom the state acts upon. And this process of normalization of the people, of integrating them into a practice, essentially allows for the state to both be an interior phenomenon, internal to the workings of the state, and also a completely exterior one which is expansionist, which can expand into every interstice of society. And as Foucault says, a corpus of knowledge, techniques, scientific discourses is formed and becomes entangled with the practice of the power to punish. So not only is it now just a question of punishment, but a whole domain of the way knowledge is structured, of techniques or forms of action. And thus, in this work, Foucault outlines several things to keep in mind about the study of discipline and punish. he says that we shouldn't be concentrating on punitive mechanisms as repressive alone, that they simply incur negative effects. He wants to insist that the juridical assemblage, essentially, also has positive effects. Not positive in the sense of good, but that punishment, as he says, becomes a complex social function. Punishment becomes not something merely centralized in the state, but diffuse in all of society. It has positive ways in which it creates things, rather than just ensuring certain things seek into the background. And thus, for Foucault, punishment is essentially a political tactic, right? It incurs normative judgments, like we said before. It incurs prescriptions of integrated action, which is essentially political in nature. And thus, Foucault wants to highlight something which is one of the most important parts of his work, but one of the hardest to get around, which is that he wants to look at a common matrix that is functioning between society and the state apparatus or the juridical apparatus that is punishing. And he calls this the epistemologico-juridical formation. So piecing that apart, that's epistemology, which is the study of knowledge or the philosophy of knowledge, and juridical, so having to do with the jury and the judge. So he wants to see knowledge as a question of integration by the state, something which the state is intimately concerned with selectively finding things that work for it and that ensure its continual functioning. And thus, he also sees the body as invested by power relations. Not only our knowledge, but what we view as our body, what we feel we ought to do with these bodies. And as a result, he says penal leniency should be treated as a technique of power. So this is merely him pointing out that being lenient isn't always necessarily good. Now, this is, of course, very provocative and very beyond good and evil, like Nietzsche. But I think the point here is fairly obvious to see that just because one is more free in the strict sense, that doesn't necessarily imply that one is free in the fullest sense. For example, we can be free to be on our phones, but we could equally say that that freedom to do things also is the freedom to be controlled by that thing, that propensity to be controlled by that thing. And thus we're brought to Foucault's essential thesis. We must analyze, rather, the concrete systems of punishment, study them as social phenomena that cannot be accounted for by the juridical structure of society alone, nor by its fundamental ethical choices. We must situate them in their field of operation, in which the punishment of crime is not the sole element. We must show that punitive measures are not simply negative mechanisms that make it possible to repress, to prevent, to exclude, to eliminate, but that they are linked to a whole series of positive and useful effects. Useful not in the sense of good, just useful for the state, which it is their task to support. And in this sense, although legal punishment is carried out in order to punish offenses, one might say that the definition of offenses and their prosecution are carried out in turn in order to maintain the punitive mechanisms and their functions. So once again, we're brought back to the notion by Deleuze and Guattari that the state is essentially concerned with conservation, and that this diffusion of punishment into the fabric of society is a question of maintaining the punitive mechanisms in the first place by doing it by more covert means. And thus he says, in our societies, the systems of punishment are to be situated in a certain political economy of the body. Even if they do not make use of violent or bloody punishment, Even when they use lenient methods involving confinement or correction, it is always the body that is at issue. The body and its forces, their utility and their docility, their distribution and their submission. So this is a very probably pessimistic way of viewing how the state views people, but I don't think it's entirely incorrect. Think, for example, of modern warfare and weapon systems, which uses data of civilians based on statistical aggregates of population centers and uses this to chart out a course which is relatively impersonal. And because, of course, this is a way of silencing the real acts that are going on here, to decrease visibility, to do things faster than fast. I mean, this feels very Paul Virilio, Speed and Politics to me, of we can chart society by the speed of its weapons, for example. And that even when we are lenient, for example, when instead of a soldier shooting someone in the face with a gun in his hand, he does it via a computer while sitting in a chair hundreds of yards away or hundreds of miles away. This is essentially concerned with the utility of the body for the state. It's a question of making things docile, of distributing bodies in a system which is oriented towards submission. Now, Foucault is very famous for his archaeology of knowledge, for example, where he wants to link the power and knowledge to essentially two parts of the same functionalist process, that power engenders knowledge and knowledge provides the sustenance for power. And he says the body is also directly involved in a political field. Power relations have an immediate hold upon it. They invest it, mark it, train it, torture it, force it to carry out tasks, to perform ceremonies, to emit signs. This political investment of the body is bound up, in accordance with complex reciprocal relations, with its economic use. It is largely as a force of production that the body is invested with relations of power and domination. But on the other hand, its constitution as a labor power is possible only if it is caught up in a system of subjection, in which need is also a political instrument, meticulously prepared, calculated, and used. The body becomes a useful force only if it is both a productive body and a subjected body. So he's pointing out that, for example, you cannot do whatever you want in society. People often say, well, technically you can do whatever you want, you just can't suffer the consequences. I really don't think that's true. There are certain actions which there are so many blocks ahead of one that it's not feasible to do certain actions in the society. And Foucault's pointing out that this essentially is defined by the relationship between power and knowledge and its effects on the body, to mark the body and to train it into certain ways. Like an animal. Humans are animals, but you get what I mean. And this essentially turns bodies into a question of productive capacity, and thus one of the chief ways in which he speaks of the body as invested with relations of power is as a force of production, your ability to work. Think of being in the U.S. and the little paid sick leave or maternity or paternity leave we get, because the state is really only concerned with you if you can be a maximally productive instrument of calculated usage by the state. And if that means overwork, well, if you live in a society where everyone is overworked, maybe we can just gaslight you into thinking this is how you're supposed to be. And thus, this is a question of productivity, but also of a form of subjective productivity, or a subjected productivity, as Foucault calls it, the political technology of the body. And thus, he says what the apparatuses and institutions operate is, in a sense, a microphysics of power, whose field of validity is situated in a sense between these great functionings and the bodies themselves with their materiality and their forces. So, right, bodies are material things. They do all kinds of things. But exactly what they do, like we've said before, is equally tied up with what should they do? What should people do with their bodies? And, for example, society is invested with these ethical tendencies. And it's a question of these apparatuses and institutions of discipline and punish to validate certain forms of action and invalidate others. So Foucault is using here the idea of microphysics of power, which is extremely similar to Deleuze and Guattari's idea of micropolitics versus macropolitics. That we like to think that the state is this big, centralized entity, but actually it's a very diffused entity. It's part of society, and it is sort of like a tree that has really deep roots. And thus, its most effective measures are done on the micro level, of controlling very little things about how you live your daily life that is going to incur being subjected to a particular way of being. And thus, this is why Foucault sees power as a relation, not an object. It's a question of a field of material forces, of things which have a number of different ways they can interact, and essentially instrumentalizing that field, determining what gets to act with what. And thus, as he says, power is exercised rather than possessed. It is not the privileged, acquired, or preserved of the dominant class, but the overall effect of its strategic positions, an effect that is manifested and sometimes extended by the position of those who are dominated. So, right, this is something. Power is an accumulation. It's not necessarily, and this is one of the purely scary parts about modern statehood, is the reach and the power of the state is so present yet so diffuse that it's very difficult to localize it. I mean, something like Donald Trump's incitement of the January 6th insurrection. I mean, this is like the most clear instance of someone in power going against the state, but the state is so all-encompassing. I mean, it covers all across the globe with its influence in various burgeoning markets, for example, that it's really hard to do anything about. And this is a properly scary thing, because Foucault says, furthermore, this power is not exercised simply as an obligation or a prohibition on those who do not have it. It invests them, is transmitted by them and through them. It exerts pressure upon them just as they themselves, in their struggle against pressure upon them, resist the grip it has on them. This means that these relations go right down into the depths of society, that they are not localized in the relations between the state and its citizens, or on the frontier between classes, and that they do not merely reproduce at the level of individuals' bodies, gestures, and behavior, the general form of the law or government. That although there is continuity, they are indeed articulated on this form through a whole series of complex mechanisms. There is neither analogy nor homology, but a specificity of mechanisms and modality. And of course, that's some kind of hints at some of the postmodernist language. You know, they love their very rich and complex vocabulary, which can certainly be off-putting and confusing at times. But he's essentially just saying that power doesn't operate in a homologous way or in an analogous way to every single thing. Power operates on a ghetto differently than it operates on an election or on some famous case study or something like this. That power is invested in a number of microphysical things. It doesn't just always operate on this grand scale. And thus, it invests all of us. It is transmitted into all of us and allows for a form of control. But he says that power is also not univocal, that they define innumerable points of confrontation, focuses of instability, each of which has its own risks of conflict, of struggles, and of at least temporary inversion of the power relations. So there is possibility for change, but I think Foucault is asking that we should get micro and not macro. This is exactly the same thing that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say. That power, we are lulled into thinking it's this big monster, but actually it's both a big monster and a small monster at the same time. It's diffuse and it's in everything. Now, Foucault mentions something maybe rather strange for many people, which is that we usually assume that knowledge exists only where power is suspended, where we can find some sort of neutrality. We have a belief that power makes mad and that we should renounce power if we want to learn things. But Foucault says we should admit, rather, that power produces knowledge, and not simply by encouraging it because it serves power or by applying it because it's useful. That power and knowledge directly imply one another. That there is no power relation within the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. These power-knowledge relations are to be analyzed, therefore, not on the basis of a subject of knowledge who is or is not free in relation to the power system, but on the contrary, the subject who knows, the objects to be known, and the modalities of knowledge must be regarded as so many effects of these fundamental implications of power knowledge and their historical transformations. So this is really just a know thyself. This is saying if we want to figure out what it is we are, because that's what Foucault is concerned with. One of his questions that he says he's concerned with in an interview is, who are we and how did we get here? And by situating ourselves like that, we are able to entertain sober gestures of change and revolution. We're able to operate on this microphysical, micropolitical level, where we can temporarily inverse the relations of power, because that's important. Everything is temporary for Foucault. He's pointing out here that these strategies are constantly changing, and his historical analysis and social analysis is partially to show how we are an effect, not a cause, how we are intimately related to things we usually don't think that we are. He says one would be concerned with the body politic as a set of material elements and techniques that serve as weapons, relays, communication routes, and supports for the power and knowledge relations that invest human bodies and subjugate them by turning them into objects of knowledge. So we usually like to think we are free subjects, and we can, for example, abstract ourselves away from the world and think about what are rights, or what is freedom, or what is true about the world. But Foucault is saying we're fooled if we want to start from that. And it's not to say we aren't free, but it's to say we are irrevocably connected to this power-knowledge relation, which produces effects. And if we understand how these effects came about, we can sort of reverse engineer things and figure out how to change from there. And to highlight this idea of the soul, which he talked about before, Foucault is not religious whatsoever. He's an atheist. But he wants to show how the soul is real, not insofar as it is some corporeal thing, but insofar as the soul is an effect of these power relations, of these power-knowledge relations, that it becomes a pole which has real effects on people. And thus he says it would be wrong to say that the soul is an illusion or an ideological effect. On the contrary, it exists, it has a reality, is produced permanently around, on, within the body by the functioning of a power that is exercised on those punished, and in a more general way, on those one supervises, trains, and corrects, over madmen, children at home and at school, the colonized, over those who are struck at a machine and supervised for the rest of their lives. This is the historical reality of this soul, which, unlike the soul represented by Christian theology, is not born in sin and subject to punishment, but is born rather out of methods of punishment, supervision, and constraint. This real, non-corporeal soul is not a substance. It is the element in which are articulated the effects of a certain type of power and the reference of a certain type of knowledge, the machinery by which the power relations give rise to a possible corpus of knowledge, and knowledge extends and reinforces the effects of this power. So thus, power and the various mechanisms that it uses for supervision, for constraint, for discipline, is a question of strategic deployment and relation. This notion of is it real should go from the functionalist point of view of what effects is this producing. It is a political reality for Foucault, the soul, insofar as it is very intimately tied with how we treat the disciplined and the punished. And thus, Foucault states, the man, described for us, whom we are invited to free, is already in himself the effect of a subjection much more profound than himself. A soul inhabits him and brings him into existence, which is itself a factor in the mastery that power exercises over the body. The soul is the effect and instrument of a political anatomy. The soul is the prison of the body. So I hope this has given you some things to think about in regard to Foucault. I hope this has given you some insight into his work, and I really encourage you to read him. He is a wonderfully erudite writer and thinker and activist. He is truly comparable to Nietzsche in his writing, which is verbose and brilliant and breathtakingly expansive. And I think his ideas are really wonderful because while they may seem abstract, they are worried about tarrying with very real phenomena. So I encourage you to watch any of my other lectures, leave constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments, and I'll see you in another lecture.